Welcome, listener, in the shadows. We bring stories into the light. Join me as we explore the encounters no one speaks of and the things that watch from the dark. If you're still here after all that, you already know the kind of stories we tell. The kind that crawl under your skin, that echo in the quiet when the episode ends. If you want to carry a piece of that darkness with you, wear what haunts you. Our exclusive line of merch is made for listeners who feel more at home in the uncanny, the unspoken, the things that don't make sense in the daylight. Shirts, hoodies, and other gear, designed with that same atmosphere of dread, mystery, and whispered wrongness. Candles support the channel, feed the stories. You can grab yours at https://theshadows printify me, and as always, don't look behind you. The Unsolved Hours, the detective who got trapped in his own case. Chapter 1. The Files. The rain hadn't let up in 3 days. It wasn't a heavy storm, not the kind that rattled the gutters or flashed the sky with lightning. No, this was the steady, needling kind. The sort of drizzle that stained the streetlights into cones of jaundiced blur and tapped endlessly against the windows like impatient fingers. Henry Calloway sat at his desk in the study, an old brass lamp throwing a dull circle of amber over the scattered papers. His hands, broad and veined with age, lingered on the worn folder at the top of the stack. He knew the case file before even opening it. The edges had gone soft from years of being handled, pored over, set aside, then drawn back into the light again. The clock above the door ticked its blunt rhythm, but he didn't look at it. Time was something he'd trained himself to ignore in these hours. Retirement hadn't broken that habit. He opened the file. Inside were photographs, yellowing with time. A street corner at dusk. A woman's shoes lying neatly side by side, as if she'd stepped out of them and walked away barefoot. A blurred face caught mid-motion on surveillance. The details hadn't changed. They never did. And yet, something about them felt different every time he looked. Henry leaned back, rubbing his temples. The rain softened to a hiss against the glass. From the living room, the low murmur of a television played. A detective rerun his wife had put on before bed. She liked the noise. He preferred the silence. Tonight, though, the noise felt like it was leaking under the door, needling him. He muttered to himself, a habit he'd picked up after 30 years on the force. Talk it through, talk it out. Don't let it stay inside your head. Case number 212, Clara Hensley, missing from her home, no forced entry, no signs of struggle. He flipped to the next photo. Surveillance shows her car leaving town. Driver never identified, plates never traced. And he pulled the corner of the photo up toward the lamp, squinting at it. And the timestamp, always the damn timestamp. It read 02:13 a.m. Every copy of the footage said the same. But Henry remembered the first time he'd reviewed it, the night she vanished. Back then, it had said 01:47. His eyes burned. He set the photo down. From the kitchen came a sound, soft, almost apologetic. The scrape of a chair leg. Henry froze, his hand hovering above the stack of files. His wife, maybe, up for a glass of water. But the sound had a strange hesitation to it, as though whoever made it wasn't used to moving furniture. "Ellen," he called. No answer. He rose slowly, joints popping, and peered into the hallway. The kitchen light was off. Darkness pooled there, thick and motionless. Henry waited, listening. The only sound was the rain and the dull hum of the TV. He felt foolish after a moment and went back to the desk, lowering himself heavily into the chair. "You're getting old," he muttered, jumping at shadows. But when he looked back at the open file, his mouth went dry. The photo of the shoes, the woman's neat, abandoned shoes, wasn't where he'd left it. It now sat on top of the folder, angled toward him. And though he knew it couldn't have changed, he swore the photo showed more darkness creeping into the frame than before, as if the streetlight in the picture had grown dimmer. Henry closed the file, pressing both palms flat on the cover. The clock ticked above the door. A faint draft stirred the papers. He thought of something his old partner, Danvers, used to say on late nights like this. "The city keeps its secrets, Henry. Some things don't want solving." Henry swallowed hard. His study felt too small now, the air too thick. He looked again at the stack of files, the unsolved hours of his career, the ones that had clung like burrs no matter how many new cases came. They weren't done with him. And for the first time in years, he felt a prickle of certainty. Maybe he wasn't done with them either. Chapter 2, The Shape of Memory. Harold Wren had always believed that every mystery left behind a shape. Not an answer, not a neat conclusion, but a kind of outline, a shadow cast by absence. When he worked homicide, it was the shape of a missing motive. When he worked missing persons, it was the shape of a life abruptly cut out, leaving ragged edges behind. He used to pride himself on being able to see those shapes where others didn't. That was the first thing his old lieutenant said about him, back when Wren was just a rookie patrolman. Kid sees things sideways. He doesn't just look. He leans into the cracks. The cracks tonight were spread across his dining table. Case files stacked high and wide, manila folders bleeding with Polaroids, crime scene photos, old cassette tapes with peeling labels. The lamp on the sideboard was the only light in the room, haloing the papers in a tired amber glow, while the rest of the house remained drowned in shadow. He worked the way he always had, methodical, muttering to himself, fingers brushing across the surface of evidence as if touch could coax memory. Case 417, he murmured, flipping open the top folder. Gretchen Yule vanished after her shift at the diner. No body, no note, nothing but her car left by the underpass. His finger tapped against the photo, clipped inside, the rust-red sedan with its driver's door wide open, interior light blazing against the night like a beacon nobody answered. He remembered walking that stretch of road, flashlight beam cutting across weeds, calling her name even though he already knew she wouldn't answer. He shut that one and reached for another. Case 612, Wilma house fire. Parents and 3 kids. He exhaled, the memory bitter. Bodies didn't match. 4 burned, not 5. Always short one. Neighbors swore they saw all 3 children go inside. He flipped the photo of the house, a sagging skeleton of char and ash, and winced. He didn't like staring too long at that one. This was how the nights went lately. Wren didn't sleep much anymore, not since retirement. The silence of the house, pressed in too heavy, like insulation, had been stripped from the walls. He filled the hours the only way he knew how, working cases, even if they weren't his anymore. As he shuffled papers, the detective part of his brain, the part he thought he'd put to bed when he turned in his badge, began piecing connections. He didn't even mean to at first. Yule's missing shift, the Wilma fire, and 2 other cases in the pile, spread apart by years, but somehow sharing the same absence. All of them left him with that same shape, as if some unseen hand had scooped something vital out of the world and left only the outline. He leaned back in his chair, rubbed his eyes. His knuckles cracked like old wood. "You're chasing smoke again, Harry," he muttered to himself. He often did, talking aloud, as if he still had a partner to bounce things off of. Coincidence doesn't mean connection. Don't make it into one. But his gaze slid back to the files. His gut, the one that had saved his life more than once, the one that had pulled confessions out of men with cold eyes, gnawed at him. He took out the Wilma fire witness statements, scanned the handwriting. Neat script, blocky print, rushed cursive. Then he froze. Halfway down the page, a single line itched at him, saw a figure at the window, thought it was the oldest boy. But when firemen went in, no one was upstairs. He swore he remembered reading that differently years back. Hadn't the witness said the figure was a woman? He could have sworn it. He shuffled through his drawer, found an older photocopy, creased and smudged with coffee stains. His eyes dragged across the page, saw a figure at the window, thought it was Gretchen Yule. Yule, the diner girl, in a file that predated her disappearance by 3 years. Wren sat very still, the silence in the room swelling until he could hear the tick of the kitchen clock, sharp and uneven. He whispered to himself low, "That's not right." His hands moved faster now, jittery, pouring through paper. He pulled another witness statement from a different case, the diner girls, and found the edges weren't the same. Someone else's handwriting, a sentence he didn't remember seeing. Heard a call from the payphone across the street, a man's voice, said he'd be back soon. But Wren had walked that block the night she vanished. There was no payphone. He remembered it clearly. The phone had been pulled out months earlier, just an empty metal bracket bolted to the wall. The folder slipped from his hand and slapped against the table. The sound jolted him. He glanced at the lamp, its glow suddenly feeling too narrow, as though the dark of the room pressed harder against the edges of its light. "Files don't change," he muttered. "They don't change." And yet, here they were. Different words, different memories. Shifting shapes in the evidence, like the outlines of truth were redrawn while he wasn't looking. The detective part of his brain wanted to pursue it, to dig harder, to line up every version and compare them side by side until some hidden truth emerged. But another part, the part that remembered long nights in morgues and alleys, the part that knew what obsession did to a man's heart, whispered something colder. Maybe the truth wasn't shifting. Maybe he was. He pressed his palms to his face, sat there for a long while, listening to the old house creak in the silence. Then, faint, almost beneath hearing, the sound of a phone ringing. But not from his kitchen, not from anywhere in the house. It was distant, muffled, like it came through the very paper spread before him. The folders lay open, waiting. Chapter 3, The Discrepancy. Frank sat hunched at the desk until his back began to seize. The kind of deep, bone-heavy ache that told him he'd been at it far longer than he realized. The clock on the wall said 3:17 a.m., but it had said 3:17 for what felt like an hour. He tapped its face with one finger, heard the rattle of the hands, but no motion followed. "Cheap junk," he muttered, but his eyes lingered on it longer than they should have. The case folder in front of him was for case 4472, Angela Barron, missing person, 1999. He remembered that one vividly. She had vanished walking home from a late shift, and her boyfriend was suspect number 1, but the alibis checked out. Every time. It was one of those that slid into the stack of cold files, leaving behind only faces in newspaper clippings and the silent weight of not knowing. He thumbed through the photos, grainy surveillance shots. The last image of Angela turning onto a corner at 11:43 p.m. A smear of rain on the lens gave her head a halo of blur. Frank frowned. He was certain he'd seen this same still before, only different. He dug deeper into the folder, pulling out the secondary disc labeled camera 4/date, 11/07/99. He loaded it into the old player he'd dug up from the precinct storage auction, static crackling as the screen came to life. The footage rolled in silence. Angela walked into the frame, hunched against drizzle, her purse strap cutting into her shoulder. She passed the corner at 11:43. Frank leaned in, waiting for her to vanish from view, but then, inexplicably, she reappeared from the opposite end of the street. Same coat, same purse, same time stamp. Frank blinked, rewound, watched again. 11:43:12, she turned the corner. 11:43:19, she emerged again, walking toward herself. Two Angelas passed each other on the sidewalk. Neither looked up, neither reacted. Frank sat there, the blood tightening in his veins, as though the room had grown suddenly smaller. "That's not right," he whispered. His throat felt dry, his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. He pressed rewind again. Play. This time, only one Angela appeared. The duplicate was gone. She turned the corner and the sidewalk remained empty. Frank sat back in his chair. What the hell? For a moment he considered fatigue, the way exhaustion could smear the senses. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours in the last 2 nights. But even so, the sensation prickling at the base of his skull wasn't simple tiredness. It was the crawling awareness that he had just witnessed something that should not be possible. He closed the case folder with too much force, the papers slipping and skewing against each other. His hand hovered on it a moment longer before he slid it back into the stack, as though burying it might put the memory back in the ground. Frank poured another drink, the clink of ice too loud in the silence. His hand trembled as he raised it, and he cursed under his breath. "You're slipping, old man, seeing things that ain't there." The phone on the desk rang. Frank jumped, the liquor sloshing down his wrist. The sound was sharp, real, demanding. He wiped his hand quickly, staring at the handset as it rang again. Nobody called this number anymore, not since he'd retired. He'd kept the line out of habit, maybe stubbornness, maybe the idea that someone, someday, would want to reach him about the past. But it had been years of silence. On the third ring, he picked it up. "Yeah, Frank," Nothing, just a low hiss like a tape left recording in an empty room. Then a voice, soft, almost whispering. "You missed it." Frank sat forward. "Who is this?" The line crackled, broke. The same words again, faint, distorted. "You missed it." The line went dead. Frank held the receiver long after the click, the static imprinted in his ear like a phantom echo. He replaced it slowly, almost afraid of what noise the next sound in the room might make. The silence felt charged now, the way the air before a storm held its breath. He looked again at the frozen wall clock, still 3:17, a memory unspooled in the back of his mind. The way Angela Barron's mother had looked at him in the station, 26 years old and hollow-eyed, asking if there was anything at all, that could tell her what had happened. He had promised her he'd call if something came up. He never had. "You missed it." The words sank in, heavier now, less like a taunt and more like a statement of fact. Something had slipped past him back then. Something had been replaying ever since, waiting for him to notice. Frank sat alone in his office, the files spread like carrion before him, and realized the old cases weren't resting in the past. They were stirring, and he was no longer sure if he had the choice to look away. Chapter 4. The tape that wasn't. The rain had slowed sometime after midnight, but its rhythm still lived in the room. A steady drip ticked against the gutter just outside his window, punctuating the silence. Morris sat hunched at his desk, the desk lamp casting a harsh circle of light that cut the room in half. The shadows on the wall leaned heavily, as if they had their own weight. He had promised himself 1 hour tonight. 1 hour to read, to make his notes, then sleep. His doctor had said routines matter, especially after retirement, but the file sitting in front of him was like a stone pressing into his chest. The Wendell case, 1998, missing persons, woman never recovered. He'd thought about her too often in the last decade. The VHS tape was still in its sleeve, marked, convenience store, 1:02 a.m., in his handwriting. He didn't remember pulling it out tonight, though. He remembered setting it aside 2 weeks ago after confirming there was nothing unusual, just the woman walking in, buying cigarettes, leaving. A dead end. Still, the tape sat in the middle of his desk now, almost expectant. "Christ," he muttered, shaking his head. His own memory was slipping. Retirement wasn't kind. He slid the tape into the player, and the monitor hummed to life, the footage flickering into the circle of lamplight. Grainy, black and white. A familiar frame. The counter, the humming freezer cases, the aisles stretching back into blurred static. At first, it was what he remembered. She entered at 1:03, hair down, wearing a raincoat too thin for the weather. She moved with a nervous kind of haste, glancing once at the door before vanishing down an aisle. Morris leaned back, exhaling through his nose. The same every time. But then the audio clicked. His head tilted. There had been no audio. He'd reviewed this tape 100 times back when it mattered. They hadn't even had a mic in the store. Yet now a faint hiss gave way to the scrape of footsteps. The woman's voice, faint but unmistakable, whispered, "Detective Morris." His lungs froze mid-breath. The woman was still on screen, selecting a pack of cigarettes, eyes lowered. The clerk rang her up without ever looking at her face. Normal, every detail the same, except her voice was coming through the monitor. "Impossible," he muttered, leaning forward, the chair squeaking. This is dubbed. Somebody tampered with. But the department had been done with VHS years before the case even closed. There was no chain of custody left. He owned this tape, no one else. The voice came again, clearer. "Why didn't you follow me?" Morris' fingers dug into the arms of his chair. His heart thumped hard against his ribs, not from fear, but from the jagged recognition of something personal, accusatory. He leaned closer to the screen. The woman at the counter was still turned slightly away, her face never fully visible. But as she reached for her change, her head tilted toward the camera, just enough to catch the light. Her lips moved, on the tape, perfectly in sync with the voice that wasn't supposed to exist. "Why didn't you follow me?" Morris staggered up so fast the chair tipped back and clattered against the floor. He slapped the stop button on the player, but the screen kept playing, the tape spooling inside. The monitor hissed louder, the raincoat woman frozen in mid-motion, her head still cocked at that impossible angle toward him. Morris' throat felt raw as he rasped, this isn't real." And then, from the speakers, almost drowned beneath the static, "Come back, you missed something." The screen went black. The tape ejected itself. It slid halfway out of the player like a tongue. Morris didn't touch it. Chapter 5. The voice on the tape. Mason leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning beneath his weight, as he rewound the cassette for the third time. His office felt smaller tonight, the walls heavy with the accumulated musk of paper and stale coffee. The rain outside had grown harder, battering the window in a rhythmic bursts that made it sound almost like someone tapping impatiently to be let in. He pressed play again. The recording, a 911 call from 1998, tagged case 11 to 72B, started with static, then the faint sound of breathing. "Hello, hello. They're inside," the caller's voice broke, a woman's, ragged with panic. Mason mouthed along with the words, remembering them from years ago. He'd worked the case himself. Home invasion, possible double homicide. Except when they'd gotten there had been no intruder, no bodies, no woman. Nothing. The call had been written off as a prank. He kept listening, though, because now, tonight, the tape was different. The voice no longer cut out at the 14-second mark, as it always had. Instead, it lingered. He could hear the woman sobbing, whispering to someone who wasn't there. "Mason, please. He's already inside." His hand froze on the desk. The old brass lamp hummed faintly, casting a jaundiced glow over the case files. The recording continued. "You're too late. You're always too late." Mason ripped off the headphones, heart pounding. His office rang with silence, the shadows dense and watchful in the corners. He stared at the tape deck, at the little wheels still spinning as if mocking him. "Bullshit," he muttered under his breath, reaching to rewind it again. His hands trembled. "I must have missed this in the past. Faulty transcription." But the truth was gnawing at him. He'd listened to this exact tape dozens of times, back when the case was fresh. He knew it had ended after 14 seconds. He slammed the tape off and pulled the case file closer, thumbing through brittle reports with smudged ink. Witness statements, neighbor interviews, dispatch logs. All of it read the same as always, until he reached the last page. The final line in the dispatch report now read, "Officer Mason Langley arrived on scene at 02:17. No evidence recovered. Subject not located." His stomach dropped. He hadn't been dispatched to that call. He remembered clearly. He'd been home off shift when the prank report came through. He'd only looked into the details later. But here it was, in official handwriting, his name written into the report as if history had been rewritten underneath his fingertips. He flipped the page over, expecting blankness. Instead, there was a Polaroid clipped to the back. It showed a suburban street lit by a single orange lamp, empty but for a figure in the middle distance. Mason's mouth went dry. The figure was turned away, but its outline was familiar, his own. The way the shoulders sloped, the tilt of the head, even the length of the jacket. The caption scrawled beneath read, "Officer Mason Langley 02:19 arrival." His hands tightened around the photo until the edges cut his palms. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't remember ever being there, but the picture insisted otherwise. The tape clicked behind him, the cassette having rewound itself without his touch. A faint hiss of static bled into the room. Then came the woman's voice again, impossibly clear, whispering just above the rain. "You're in the wrong place, Mason." Chapter 6. The Wrong Midnight. Frank sat at his kitchen table with the files spread in a mosaic of failure, every page glinting in the yellow lamplight. He was drinking his third cup of black coffee, but the bitterness did nothing to cut the raw fatigue in his bones. His hand shook as he wrote notes in his scrawl, a detective's hand gone unsteady with age and disuse. He looked at the clock above the stove. 11:57. He looked down, rubbed his eyes, then looked up again. 11:42. The second hand was jerking backward in stuttered steps, as if the clock couldn't decide which way midnight was. He blinked hard, stood up, tapped the glass face with his knuckle. The ticking steadied. Forward again. He sat down, but a heavy feeling had settled into the air, thick, almost static, like the moment before a storm breaks. He put on an old case tape, something from the Holloway Strangler, a murder that never added up. The tape hissed, and the familiar sound of dispatch came through. Unit 12, possible suspect last seen near. Static swallowed the voice. Then a new voice entered. Low, male, but warped, like something chewing on the syllables. Frank, you weren't there. The hairs rose on the back of his neck. He hit stop so hard the player clicked, then ejected the cassette with a snap. The tape had no label. He frowned. Every tape in his archive had a label. He picked it up, his own handwriting, except the date scribbled on the side read October 19, 2023. That was impossible. That was next month. He poured another coffee. His hand was trembling bad enough that he spilled a streak down the counter. He stared at it, his reflection warped in the dark puddle, and for half a breath he thought the reflection moved different than him, like a half second too slow. He muttered to himself, I need sleep, that's all this is. But then his phone rang, the landline in the kitchen, an old rotary one, beige, heavy as a brick. It hadn't rung in years. Frank picked it up slowly, pressing it against his ear. Hello. For a second, nothing but hiss. Then, Unit 12, are you on scene? Frank froze. It was his own voice. Younger, 10, maybe 15 years younger. He recognized the clipped way he'd used to answer calls before he lost patience with protocol. Who is this? He said sharply. The voice on the line repeated, identical, tone for tone. Who is this? And then laughter. But it wasn't human laughter. It was stretched out like a vinyl record left in the sun, low and bubbling, then too high, then cutting off mid-breath. He slammed the phone back on the receiver so hard the bell inside clanged. The living room clock chimed the hour. He turned, midnight. But the stove clock said 10:11. The old wristwatch on his arm, still his department-issued Seiko, read 3:24. And outside, through the curtains, the world was dim with that strange blue pallor, not quite night, not quite dawn. His chest tightened. He stumbled toward the window and pulled the curtain back. The street outside was empty, too empty. No passing cars, no porch lights, no sounds at all. He lived in a suburban cut-through that should have had at least one idiot kid revving a muffler at this hour. Instead, nothing. And then movement. On the corner beneath the street lamp, a woman was standing, too still. Her posture rigid, head tilted slightly up like she was staring at his window from a block away. Frank whispered hoarsely, No, 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 no. He recognized her face. He shouldn't have, but he did. Marla Holloway, victim 3. The Holloway Strangler had left her in an alley on the West End, beaten until her jaw was broken clean in half. She'd been 30 years dead. But there she was, standing in his street, head tilting, not moving. Frank let the curtain fall. His pulse hammered in his temples. He went to the files, shoving them into stacks, trying to impose some kind of order. But his eyes caught on details that shouldn't have existed. Photographs of crime scenes with backgrounds different than he remembered, reports where his own handwriting contradicted itself, time stamps that didn't belong. The past was bleeding. Not memory, not evidence. Reality itself was leaking through like ink in water. Frank grabbed the nearest file, slammed it shut, and whispered to himself, Stay grounded, stay grounded. You're still the detective here. But the words didn't land, not fully, because behind them he could hear it, a whisper, not in the room but between the seconds. You never solved them, Frank. They solved you. Chapter 7. Frank sat at his desk with the yellow lamp humming softly above, the kind of light that bleeds warmth only because everything else around it is cold. His office had grown smaller over the last few nights. He swore the walls pressed in fractionally, as though the very drywall remembered his presence too well. The file folders, once his allies, now sat like stacked gravestones on the desk. He rubbed his eyes, fingertips grinding against the bone of his sockets until bursts of color danced in the dark. Enough for one night, he muttered. His voice sounded smaller than he intended, and it didn't echo the way voices should in the quiet of a room. The air had turned heavier. The clock on the wall ticked out of sync with his pulse, fast, then slow, then skipping altogether. He decided he had to leave, had to get out and put his body into the rhythm of normal life before he cracked like an old plate. He grabbed his coat from the rack, pulled it over his shoulders, and pushed open the door. The hallway beyond smelled faintly of mildew and floor wax, the familiar tang of the precinct building, even though he was home. No, not the precinct. His home, his study. He blinked hard. The light fixture above buzzed with a faint electrical hum. It all felt wrong, but exhaustion blurred the wrongness into something forgivable. He stepped forward, heels striking the wooden floor. Each step echoed in an exaggerated, cavernous way. He took 3 paces, then turned left to the front door. Except he wasn't at his front door. He was at his office door again. The brass knob, the chipped paint. His coat still hanging on the rack beside it. He blinked, then twisted the knob, pulling the door open once more, this time with force. Again, the same hallway, same buzzing light. His stomach clenched. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." He stepped through again. The air was slightly cooler this time, the hum louder, the faint mildew odor sharper, as if the hall itself deepened each time he crossed. He walked quickly, breathing shallow, and when he reached where the door should open out to his porch, he was standing inside his office. His desk, his lamp, his walls. Frank's breath hitched. His mouth went dry, and he gripped the desk edge to steady himself. The papers were not as he had left them. Several case files lay open, pages splayed, though he hadn't touched them. A tape recorder sat on top of one folder, its red light glowing faintly, though he hadn't pressed record. He turned on his heel, heart pounding. His window overlooked the street outside, but when he yanked the blinds open, there was nothing, just black. Not the dark of night with the faint glow of distant street lamps, but absolute, depthless absence. It was like staring into a pupil that consumed everything. Frank staggered back from the window, chest tightening. He turned again and grabbed the recorder. His hands shook as he clicked stop and then rewind. A sharp hiss filled the room. Then, "Detective Marlowe, you should have left it alone." The voice was his. Gravelly, tired, but his. He hadn't spoken those words, not yet. The tape clicked to silence. Frank's throat constricted. He slammed the recorder down hard enough that it rattled across the desk. The door stood there, quiet and unassuming, as though daring him to try again. His pulse thudded in his ears. A primal panic clawed at him, something deeper than rational fear. He didn't want to touch it, didn't want to cross through. But staying meant suffocating in this recursive cell that looked like his office, but was no longer his office. He whispered to himself, "One more time." And when he opened the door again, the hall beyond stretched impossibly long, lined with doors on both sides, each one marked Marlowe. The light above him flickered. The loop had closed its fist. Chapter 8. The case of himself. The walls were closing in, but Martin did what he always did. He treated it like work. A new case. His case. The air in the office was heavy, static charged, as though every surface had been rubbed raw by invisible hands. The faint hum of the desk lamp was the only sound left grounding him, but even that seemed louder than it should be, as if mocking his nerves. He opened his battered notebook, the same one he'd used years ago for stakeouts and interviews, and dated the page. April 14, 11:06 p.m. Then he underlined it twice. "All right," he muttered to himself, voice gravelly in the silence. "We've got an environment, we've got a subject, we've got a perimeter." His handwriting was shaky, but he pressed the pen hard, carving the paper as though force alone could make his reality stable. He stood and approached the office door. Hand on the knob, breath held. He twisted it. The hinges creaked. Beyond lay the same hallway he'd walked 100 times during his years on the force. Carpet worn, exit sign buzzing, the faint smell of cigarettes that clung to the plaster. He forced himself to step through. His heart thudded in his throat. He walked the length of the hall, past the vending machine, past the stairwell door. He pushed through to the outside world and found himself back inside. His desk, his lamp, his open notebook. Martin froze, bile burning the back of his throat. He turned. The hallway was gone. Only the office remained. "Okay," he rasped, pulling out his phone. He set it on the desk, camera pointed at the door. "Let's see it happen." He pressed record. Again, he opened the door, stepped into the hall. This time he counted each footfall. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. His voice echoed unnaturally, overlapping itself, as if he were hearing a playback delayed by seconds. By the time he reached 10, The hallway bled at the edges like film overexposed. He blinked and was back at the desk again. The phone sat where he left it, screen glowing. He grabbed it with clammy hands and hit stop. His pulse raced as he replayed the footage. The video showed him opening the door, walking out into the hall. The angle was low, fixed, mundane. He braced himself to see the impossible cut, but on screen he never returned. Martin stared, his mouth hanging open. On the video, his body just kept walking down the hall until it vanished into static, the frame dissolving like burning film. He swallowed hard. Control test. He took a mug from the desk and hurled it through the door. He waited. He turned back. The mug sat whole and still, right where it had been on the desk. No crack, no missing handle, no noise of it hitting the floor. His teeth ground together. Evidence is being tampered with. His own voice sounded alien to him, like he was trying to talk himself into sanity. He tore open drawers, looking for anything he could use. Tape recorder. He found an old police-issued Olympus, long dead but familiar. He dug out batteries and forced them in with trembling hands. He pressed record. Spoke steadily into the device. Test 1. Officer Martin Greaves. Subject myself. Time distortion. Entanglement loop. I do not trust the environment. He set the recorder on the desk, left the office, and predictably returned right back. He grabbed the Olympus again. The tape hissed. His voice played back, warped and low, repeating, I do not trust myself. I do not trust myself. I do not trust myself. Martin's knees went weak. He slammed the recorder off. For the first time in years, he felt real terror, the same helplessness he saw in crime victims' eyes. He wasn't the detective anymore. He was the suspect, the missing person, the unsolved case, and the walls wanted him to stay that way. Chapter 9. The stillness. The night had gone silent. Not the silence of an empty street or the quiet of late hours. It was thicker than that. The kind of silence that pressed against the eardrums, like the air itself had been padded. A hush so complete it made Harold wonder if he'd gone deaf without realizing it. For a long while he didn't move. He sat at his desk, hands folded loosely in front of him, staring at the spread of files he had left open. The papers no longer seemed to matter. They weren't evidence anymore. They weren't fragments of crimes unsolved. They were just marks, paper with ink, as meaningless as doodles in the margins. He tried to recall when exactly that feeling had set in. Hours ago, days. His sense of time was soft now, like a bruise he couldn't stop pressing. He thought of clocks, of how much of his life had been ruled by them. Shift schedules, interrogations marked by minutes, the strict ticking rhythm of procedure. And here, no ticking. He realized the small wall clock above the filing cabinet had stopped. The hands were frozen just past 2. 2:07, he muttered aloud, the words breaking the silence. His voice sounded strange, swallowed too quickly by the air. He rose, slow and stiff, and wandered toward the clock. He put a finger against the glass, as if his touch could jolt it forward. Nothing. He checked his watch. Dead, not just unmoving. The second hand twitched faintly in place, like a fly pin to a board. For some reason, that didn't frighten him the way it should have. It only settled a stillness deeper into his bones, a resignation almost. Harold returned to his chair, sat back down, and let his gaze drift to the corners of the room. The shadows there looked thicker than usual. He thought of the phrase, dead air, the way technicians used to describe silence on the radio. That was what this felt like, dead air, stretched across reality itself. He exhaled slowly. So what now? He asked no one. The office didn't answer. The strange thing was he didn't feel entirely alone, not watched, not threatened, just accompanied, like someone sat with him in quiet companionship, outside the range of his sight. He thought of his late partner, Daniels, who used to sit through long stakeouts with him without a word. They didn't need to talk. The silence between them was a language of its own. Maybe this was the same. Maybe whatever was here with him wasn't enemy or ally, just present. He reached for one of the files. The page felt cool, almost damp, as he lifted it. He began reading, not to find answers, but to give shape to the quiet. His voice murmured steadily as he recited details of a long-forgotten case. Dates, names, statements. It didn't matter if the facts had warped, if the paper itself was lying to him. The rhythm of the words grounded him, gave the illusion of order, and the silence listened. When he finished the last line of the report, he set it down carefully. He felt calmer than he had in days, maybe weeks. For the first time since the anomalies began, there was no thundering heart, no frantic need to make sense of it all, just acceptance. He looked toward the stopped clock again, then closed his eyes. 2:07, he whispered, almost as a prayer. The office waited with him, perfectly still. Chapter 10, the silence had a weight to it now. Not just the ordinary hush of his house late at night, the fridge humming, the faint settling of wood beams in the walls, but something denser, more deliberate. Like a hand pressed against his ears, a lid over the world. Cole sat at his desk with the files spread before him, but he hadn't touched them in hours. His pen was still laid across the yellow notepad, the last line written jaggedly in his own hand. Test 0041. Door opened. Return same. He hadn't crossed it out, hadn't even dotted the I. He'd just let the ink hang there, unfinished. The clock above the door read 1:12 AM. He'd checked it 3 times. It hadn't moved once. Cole rubbed at his eyes and tried to lean into routine. That's what steadied him before, what had kept him sane when cases dragged him into the kind of territory good cops didn't want to admit existed. Routine. Observe, write, test, repeat. He opened the bottom drawer of the desk and pulled out his old digital recorder. It was battered, scuffed along the edges, but it still blinked on with a red LED. His thumb hovered over the record button. Finally, he pressed it. Cole Mercer, testing audio log entry 1, he said. His voice sounded strange, too loud, too soft, like the walls were tilting the words back at him. Currently observing temporal anomalies. Time at 1:12. Feels longer, testing auditory consistency. He set the recorder down on the desk, exhaled through his nose and waited. Tick, tick, tick. The sound came from the recorder. It shouldn't have ticked. There was no metronome in it, no clock. Yet the faint sound persisted, like a watch buried in its circuitry. Cole clicked it off and shoved it aside, jaw tightening. His pulse was steady, trained that way even after retirement, but the quiet dread had a hook in him. Something about the noise had been wrong. He stood, stretching his knees, and walked to the window. The street outside was still, too still. No headlights rolling down Oak Street, no dog walkers, no late-night shift workers. The lamppost at the corner swayed, but there was no wind. He tried to shake it off. Nothing unusual, just a quiet night, he muttered to himself. But his reflection disagreed. The man in the glass looked like him, but off, shadowed under the eyes, lips pale, shoulders slumped as if weighed down by something heavier than fatigue. Cole lifted his hand, and the reflection lifted too. Perfectly, too perfectly, like it knew the movement before he made it. He shut the blinds. Back at the desk, the files were waiting. A few of them had shifted subtly. He knew he hadn't stacked them that way. But instead of reaching for them, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. Breathe in, breathe out. Detective's discipline. Patience was the strongest tool he had. The clock still read 1:12. The silence still pressed close. And Cole, for the first time in years, felt like he was on the wrong side of the evidence board. Chapter 11. The night was quieter than it should have been. Not the comfortable quiet of a late neighborhood or the heavy hush before rain, but the sort of silence that presses against the eardrums, demanding to be noticed. Walter sat hunched at his desk, the green-shaded lamp throwing an oval of muted light across the case files. His pencil scratched idly at a notepad, though the marks made little sense, half-formed diagrams, times written and rewritten, names underlined until the page wore thin. He hadn't been sleeping. He hadn't even been resting. The coffee in his mug had gone cold hours ago, but he kept sipping at it out of habit, the bitterness anchoring him. He caught himself muttering, just low whispers, the cadence of an interrogation. Timeline doesn't hold. Location compromised. Witness unreliable. Phrases he'd said 1,000 times in the precinct, but they felt strange now, like rehearsing lines to a play he'd long forgotten the meaning of. He leaned back, massaging the base of his neck. The wall clock ticked steadily above him. 9:47. He shut his eyes, opened them again. 9:47. His gaze lingered. The second hand had frozen. A thread of unease wound through him. He stared at the clock long enough that his eyes began to burn, then pushed himself out of the chair and crossed the room. The moment he touched the glass face, the second hand lurched forward, ticking again as though it had never stopped. Walter exhaled, shaky. He looked down at his hand. The faintest smear of dust clung to his fingertips, though he hadn't noticed the clock being dirty before. He rubbed them together. They felt gritty, almost like ash. "Lack of sleep," he muttered. His voice sounded thin in the room, and he startled at the sound of it, as if someone else had spoken. Back at the desk, the files had shifted. Not much, just a subtle shuffle. The top folder, the one about the Baxter girl, now lay at a crooked angle. He hadn't touched it in hours. He reached for it but stopped. The air felt wrong, heavy, as though touching it would confirm something he wasn't ready to. He circled the desk instead, like a suspect he was trying to read, letting the tension spool out. Finally, he snapped the folder open. Inside, the photos had changed. He froze. They weren't crime scene shots anymore, not alleyways or living rooms or blood-marked stairwells. They were photographs of his own office. The grainy kind, black and white, like security stills. One showed his desk exactly as it was now. Another captured the angle of him sitting in the chair, head bent over notes. The most recent, dated tonight, showed him standing with his hand on the clock. Walter's throat closed. He flipped faster, hands shaking. The last photo in the stack was blank, just a rectangle of glossy black. He stared until, slowly, faint outlines bled into the surface. Shoulders, a skull of light where a face should be. Standing in the corner behind his desk, he slammed the folder shut. His breath thundered in his chest. The silence deepened. It wasn't absence anymore, it was presence, something listening. Walter rubbed his temple hard enough to see sparks behind his eyelids. He told himself, "You're seeing patterns. You're sleep-deprived. Nothing's changed." But when he looked back at the desk, the folder was gone, and the clock had stopped again. Chapter 12. The case collapses. The tape recorder clicked. No hand had touched it. No finger brushed the play button. Yet the thing hummed to life on his desk, spooling a tape that he had never loaded. "Detective Firth," it said. His own voice, ragged, splintering at the edges like a badly spliced film reel. You're not going to like what comes next." Daniel lurched back from the desk, his chair wheels squealing across the wood. His throat worked uselessly against the dryness closing it. He could hear his pulse in his ears, heavy as the ocean. He whispered hoarse, "That's not me." But the voice on the tape was him. Down to the little rasp he got after smoking too much. Down to the half-swallowed syllables when fatigue clipped his words. Only now it spoke as if from the end of a very long hall. A voice stretching across corridors that shouldn't exist. "I've been here before," the tape hissed. "Been here before. Been here before." It caught in a loop, repeating, grinding into his brain like teeth on bone. He tore the recorder's cord from the wall and the office lights cut out. Total darkness. A suffocating velvet pressing against his eyes. His breath thundered in the void, faster, louder, until it wasn't just his breath anymore. Something else drew air in the dark. Something close enough that he could hear saliva moving against unseen teeth. "Detective," it whispered. Not his voice this time, but thinner. A child's imitation of his tone. It came from the far side of the office, then from behind the file cabinets, then directly at his shoulder. He spun and slammed his shin into his desk. Pain bloomed, but he barely registered it, because the office wasn't his office anymore. The ceiling was wrong. It vaulted higher than it should. The wallpaper peeled into infinite corridors, each one lined with filing cabinets that stretched into nothing. And his desk had multiplied. 12 of them, 15, then an ocean of identical desks spreading into a horizon he could not see. Every desk had the same tape recorder. Every recorder played the same voice, his voice. "Detective Firth, not going to like what comes next." The sounds stacked and folded, hundreds of Daniels talking at once until language became noise. His mind, trained for years to pin down inconsistencies, scrambled to classify. Was this psychosis? Oxygen deprivation? The rational anchor in his skull reached for definitions, while the rest of him understood only the raw animal fact. He wasn't leaving. Case fell, he muttered, the word absurd in his mouth. He stumbled toward one of the cabinets, yanking it open. Papers spilled like entrails, but the pages were blank, every last one. Blank and yet heavy, as though written on with something invisible. He turned them sideways under the light, no, not blank. His handwriting, faint, carved into the fibers. A looping sentence across every sheet. I've been here before. Over and over until the pages dissolved into white noise. Daniel screamed, not words, just a raw, furious sound ripped out of his lungs to drown the impossible. His voice carried, bounced off the cabinets and came back wrong, slower, heavier, thick with someone else's breath. He clutched his badge in his fist until the metal cut into his palm. The only real thing left. The only proof that he had ever been Daniel Firth. But even that, when he opened his hand, was warped. The letters of his name blurred and crawled across the surface, as if refusing to hold still. Detective Firth bent double, breath shattering, body shaking with exhaustion and terror. Somewhere in the dark, the voices began again. Hundreds of them whispering in a rhythm, no longer looping, chanting. Write it down, Daniel, write it down. His desk, the real one, the original, slid out of the shifting dark. Tape recorder spinning, pen waiting. The case wasn't over. It had never begun. It had always been this. His last coherent thought before the spiral swallowed him whole was that this was not madness. No, this was procedure. This was the end of the case file. And then he sat, and he wrote. You made it back for now. But the things in the dark never truly leave, do they? They watch, they wait, and perhaps they remember you now, too. If you want to hear more, if you dare to listen again, step back into the shadows. Like the video. Subscribe, but know this, some doors once opened do not close so easily.